Hello and welcome to Cheshire Audio. Now today we're going to be doing another retro review. There's a quite interesting backstory with this one, and whether it's true or not I don't know. It's one of these stories that seems to circulate in the hi-fi industry about things. Apparently, end of the 70s, Ivor T from Brun was either having a meal or probably in a pub in Glasgow, I would imagine, with a hi-fi reviewer or somebody in the hi-fi industry. And at the time, Linn Products produced the Sondek turntable and the Linn isobaric speakers, which were a huge, great, speaker with 6 drivers, and that was their range. It was the turntable and the isobaric speaker. And apparently the conversation had gone down the lines, saying to Ivor T from Brun, of course, you can't make a loudspeaker, sort of an audiophile quality loudspeaker, in a small box. You have to have the big drivers, the big box. And Ivor had turned to him and said, Linn Kan. And the rest is history. Because what we're going to review today is the Linn Kan. Because Linn Kan. Still don't know if it's true, but it's a great story. Okay, yeah, this is my own pair of Linn Kan Mark 1s, and they are very early Mark 1s. These are probably around 82, 83, which was was the sort of first generation of them. The very first pair, I believe, were sort of chipboard cabinet and just standard drivers, whatever. This pair are slightly later, probably a few months after that, where they started to tweak a little bit with the drivers, sort of improve things. And I'm going to take the grill off. And normally these are glued on, but I've broken most of my fingernails getting that off. So you can see the remains of glue and everything. Cans use CAF B110 base mid unit, and this is an original pair. You can tell this is an original pair because they've got a ScanSpeak treble unit. Quite quickly after this, they went to the Hikiphone, which is it could be argued is a much more refined driver. I sometimes wonder whether the ScanSpeak's a little bit more exciting to listen to. Really. I think a few people were sort of complained that the cans were a little bit aggressive, and it was down to the ScanSpeak, which it was. To be fair, it was sort of what was causing it. But the cans have always been very sort of kind of Marmite as far as loudspeakers go. And if you're not from the UK, that means it's people have very black and white views on it. They're either wonderful or awful. There doesn't seem to ever be any mid-ground with cans. Partly, I think that comes from the fact that they're not an easy speaker to get right, and it's not a case of them being physically that difficult to drive. Although they're not really easy to drive, but they're not crazily difficult to drive. But they do seem to be very fussy of signal source. Interestingly, seeing as Linn particularly were the ones who sort of promoted the idea of the source as being the most important part of a system. They are very fussy of source. So if you put them into a mediocre system, you're just going to hear how mediocre your system is. You're not going to get the sort of full, the full effect of the things. And it's kind of brought on to me how good these can be. In my very first job in hi-fi, I remember being in one of the main demo rooms, and one of the other chaps who worked there, who'd been there quite a long time, it was setting a system up, and he said, just listen to this. And first thing he did, he'd put on a full Linn name system, and it was a Sondek, the top spec Sondek at the time, with the top spec name amplifier of the time, which would have been 32 high cap and 135 monoblocks, and he had it on in the room with isobarics, which were Linn's big speaker. Whoever listened to that, it sounded wonderful. It was really good sounding setup. And he stood up, switched everything off, carried the speakers out, then brought the cans in. Now people accuse the cans of being very lightweight, quite squawky, particularly the ScanSpeak versions. Just difficult to live with because they just don't really. They don't do the hi-fi thing. They haven't got the big bass. They haven't got the refinement and all that sort of thing. But they do rhythm very well. Now he brought the cans into that system on the top, like I say, the top deck, the top amplifier. Put the cans in, and you couldn't tell that the speakers had been changed. When they were driven right, they produced fabulous bass extension. They're an incredibly dynamic speaker. I mean, I don't think there's ever been anything produced which is as dynamic as the Kan, really, particularly the early ones. And it sort of kind of, like I say, it kind of brought it home to me how important source is, how important drive is in a system, and the speakers can only keep giving more. If you give them more signal and more drive, they can only keep giving you more. So yeah, it's quite a good lesson, that, really. Like I say, these are a very early pair. You can tell it's a scan speak because there's no logoing on here. The Hikifon driver has a Linn logo on it. The very, very early, I mean, this is a KEF B110 driver which was used in all sorts of designs, including one that I'll mention in a minute. The very original ones were just the straight drivers fitted in, but they did seal in. This is one thing about Linn, they did seal all the drivers in, so there's a lot of attention to detail, again, which I'll mention in a minute. But the very early ones were, like I said, the driver just put in, sealed in. Quite quickly after that, they started to, I can't think what it was. It was like they used almost like a car under seal type mastic on the back of the frame of the driver. Because if you've ever taken a driver out and sort of tapped the metal cage that it's constructed within, they do ring quite considerably, actually, like a little bell. And you just tap them like that, and you get quite a sort of ring off them. And Linn started to damp that sort of metal element, and you got much cleaner sound from the drivers. I mean, if I used to actually modify people's speakers for them, things like old AR-18s, KEF coders, original Mission 700s, things like that. And part of the modification was to damp the drivers, and it was really effective actually. The other thing being to seal in the drivers, because these were sealed boxes, there's no port. So if you can get that seal as good as possible, so everything that's screwed in, wherever there's any sort of possibility of air getting out, if that's sealed, then the drivers will work as designed. There's no, even the smallest of sort of let-bys around the driver, or the sockets at the back or anything like that, messes with the sound quality, and it sort of doesn't mess with it in a linear way. You get sort of certain frequencies that aren't quite as strong, or things that are prominent that shouldn't be prominent. And also these were wired internally with quite decent cable as well, which again it was quite unusual. Most manufacturers didn't have that attention to detail that Linn did. Like I said, I think the very early versions of these were chipboard. I think these are what they call Medite. It's like it's almost like an early forerunner of MDF, I think, which is much denser and it's much easier to work, and it's a bit more consistent really than other materials. So after that there was a Hikifon driver. Then they went to the socketry on the back, and they went to bi-wire to the Kan 2, the bi-wireable. And I think they ran from 82 through. I think the last modification was around the sort of end of the 90s, probably about 1990 actually. Then they ran for a few years after that. They would be quite an expensive speaker now, actually, Kans. I think looking at the build quality of them and everything that's involved, they'd probably be, I don't know, £1,500, a couple of £1,000. It's very difficult in today's market to try and figure these things out. So I know I'm talking to somebody who priced up remanufacturing Haybrook HP1s, which were sort of a budget speaker years ago, and they were coming out at sort of £800 or £900. So Kans, with all that attention to detail, I would imagine them be quite a bit more expensive. You might be thinking, surely these are just a BBC monitor. They look identical in a lot of ways to the BBC LS35A that were manufactured. You could actually you could make what was called an LS35A and other models as well, actually, under license to the BBC. And there's a few companies that took up the license. I think Rogers were the main one. Harbath did a version. More recently, there's companies like Graham, Falcon. Goodman's had a version of the LS35A, which was a cabinet very similar to this. I think some of the later versions of the LS35As were in plywood cabinets. B110 driver, but they tended to use the T27 treble unit. And if you look at them internally, they weren't built quite to the same standards as the seal. They weren't sealed up the same way. But the BBC versions had very, very complex crossovers, so they were absolutely flat. Cans are not flat, I'll tell you that now. The response of a can is not flat. But if you compare the two, the can is much more upfront, much more dynamic. 35As are beautifully detailed and open, and vocals are real. But there's something missing. There's some, in certain circumstances, 35As can sound amazing. Certain amplifiers just seem to gel with them somehow. Similarly with cans, they just seem to need loads of current, and then but they're a completely different sounding speaker. These do rock amazingly. LS35As sort of light classical and that sort of thing sounds wonderful through LS35As. They look the same, sound completely different, absolutely completely different. And these cans particularly becoming very collectible. I mean, they still fetch quite reasonable money. I mean, even my pair now in this sort of quite rough-looking state that they're in, probably worth £300 or £400. I would have thought second hand. It's quite surprising how they've held the value. Yeah, another thing about cans, they were very fussy of stands. They did need a really good speaker stand, possibly because they're quite heavy cabinet, and they sort of containing the energy they worked at the very best with a really lightweight stand. I mean, around the time these were produced, or just after, a very popular stand was the Cliffstone Foundation stand, which is a really high mass stand with sort of flat top plate at the top and bottom, and they just didn't work with cans at all. It just completely killed the dynamics. So we always used to use them originally with the very first can stand, which was a sort of tubular steel top and two legs down, and a tubular steel bottom with spikes. And then the later can 2 stand, which was a lot better, was flat top plate with spikes, and then 4 legs, and then a sort of H pattern base with spikes, and they were very, very light, and they were so rigid and really light, and they just sounded brilliant with cam. It just really brought them alive even more, really. So yeah, they were quite fussy with stands, but nowadays you don't tend to get that really. Stands make a difference, but you don't get speakers which are quite that fussy somehow. So yeah, nothing to do. Let's have a look at the back panel. Like I said, these are early ones, so they're a little bit different to the later models. So there you go on the back panel, just standard RS catalogue terminals on the back, really. Just quite a cheap terminal, to be honest, but very effective, I suppose. So binding posts, there's a hole through to put bare wire. You can use a spade into there. Make sure they're nice and tightened down. Use a 4mm on the back. Quite shortly after this, they went to a much better quality socket, which was just a 4mm. They didn't have any binding post options on them. And then they went to the by-wire versions, which are treble and bass separated out with links between, so you could separate them by amp. You could actually order these as active as well, and active cans is something else. I haven't heard a pair of active cans for a long time, but they really take your breath away. So that's an amplifier per driver, well, an amplified channel per driver, with the crossover sort of sorted out at low level instead of high level, which is much more accurate, so you get a much cleaner sound. I mean, Linn sort of went down the active route probably a little bit too far in some respects, because the problem with active is it does back you into a corner for upgrades, because the amplifiers have to be matched to the speakers and the crossovers and everything else, so it gets a little bit intense, and it's kind of good but kind of limiting if you're the sort of person who wants to upgrade. So yeah, active was an interesting thing, but I was never totally myself got behind it very much. Yeah, I think that's it for the cans. Let's just turn the camera around. Yeah, so that's it for this retro review. Still love a pair of cans, really. I mean, they're quirky and, you know, lovable in some ways, difficult to live with in others, but they have got something about them, and they're still listening in the demo room today. I mean, they've still got it. They've still got it. There's still something special about cans, even after all this time. So yeah, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and give us a like. Thanks for all the comments. I must admit I don't get a chance to really answer many comments now. There's so many now. It would take me most of an afternoon to sort of answer everything. So I tend to flick through, and if there's anything, you know, major in there, I'll do it. If you want to contact me, email's probably the best way to do it, which will be the end of the video. So yeah, thanks for that. I'll see you in a future video. Thank you very much.